Nora Briggs was 9 years old when her mother pressed a tin box into her hands and said three words she did not understand until 5 years later. When the earth cracks. May Briggs died 4 days after that. The box sat in the back of the barn, behind a broken harrow and two rotting fence posts, for 5 years. What was inside it saved everything, but that is the end of the story. This is the beginning. The Briggs family had farmed the same 38 acres in Harrow County, Nebraska, for 3 generations. Not good acres, never good acres. The land sat low on the eastern edge of the county where the clay ran thick and the topsoil was thin, and the water table did whatever it wanted regardless of what the season demanded. Every spring the low corner flooded. Every dry summer it cracked. The neighbors to the north, the Fultons, had 200 acres of rolling ground that drained well and held moisture and yielded corn at rates that made Dale Fulton the kind of man people listened to at the feed store without him having to raise his voice. The Briggs land yielded half that on a good year. On a bad year, it yielded the particular silence that falls over a kitchen table when a father is doing math in his head and the numbers are not working. Samuel Briggs was 48 years old in the spring of 2019. He had his mother's eyes and his father's hands and a cough that had started 4 winters ago and had not left. The doctor in Kearney called it chronic and said the word carefully, the way doctors say words they want you to hear but not panic about. Samuel heard it. He did not panic. He went home and turned the south field and did not mention it to anyone, which was the way he handled most things that frightened him. His oldest daughter was 14, thin-armed, quiet in the way her mother had been quiet. Not the quietness of someone with nothing to say, but the quietness of someone who is listening to things other people are not listening to. She had May's habit of pressing her palm flat against the soil when she crouched in the field, not checking for moisture exactly, just touching it, the way you touch the hand of someone you love to remind yourself they are still there. May had been gone 5 years. The girl had her mother's habit of watching the creek. In February of 2019, Samuel spent 4 days in the hospital in Kearney. A bad week for the cough. Nothing that required surgery, the doctor said, but something that required rest, which was a word Samuel treated the way most farmers treat forecasts, with polite skepticism and no actual change in behavior. Nora drove him home on the 5th day in the old Chevy pickup. She was 14 and did not have a license, and the county road was straight and empty, and neither of them mentioned it. While her father was in the hospital, Nora cleaned the barn. She did it because it needed doing, and because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the barn had not been properly cleaned since before May died, and there were corners of it that felt like standing inside a grief that had not finished moving through the family yet. She worked from the front toward the back, moving equipment, stacking boards, pulling out things that had been pushed in and forgotten. Behind the broken harrow, wedged between two fence posts that had gone soft with rot, was a wooden crate with a rusted clasp. Inside the crate, wrapped in oilcloth, was a tin box, heavier than expected. The lid had been sealed with candle wax, pressed carefully around the seam, and on the top, in permanent marker that had faded but not disappeared, in May's handwriting, "When the earth cracks. Open then, not before." The girl stood in the barn holding the tin box for a long time. She did not open it. Not yet. She carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and sat across from it while the February wind pushed against the windows. She thought about her mother. She thought about the 3 words May had said when Nora was 9, holding this same box with both hands, her face carrying the expression of someone leaving instructions they hope will never be needed. She put the box on the shelf above her bed and went back to the barn. It was 2 weeks later, after Samuel was home and resting, and the cough had settled back into its usual low register, that she opened the crate again and found what else was inside it. Under the tin box, wrapped separately in the same oilcloth, was a journal. The cover was brown leather, cracked at the spine, held together by a length of twine that had gone brittle with age. The first entry was dated March 4th, 1889. The handwriting was cramped and formal. the penmanship of someone who had learned it as a discipline rather than an expression. The name at the top of the first page was Caleb Briggs, her great-great-grandfather. The journal came inside. Nora sat at the kitchen table and read it by the light above the stove while Samuel slept. Caleb Briggs had been a methodical man. His entries were not stories. They were records. Rainfall measured by a tin cup nailed to the fence post. Creek depth marked every Sunday morning on a stick driven into the bank. Soil temperature in the low corner noted beside soil temperature in the upper field. Compared, considered, written down without drama. He had been watching this land the way you watch a patient whose condition you are not yet sure of, carefully and without assumptions. In the summer of 1894, the drought came. Caleb described it in plain, devastating language. The creek stopped in July. The natural pond on the Garvey property to the north, a pond that had held water through 2 previous dry summers, went to mud by August. Wells dropped. Livestock were sold at loss because there was no water to maintain them. Families left. Caleb wrote their names without commentary, one per line, like a list of things that cannot be replaced. Hartley left. Munder left. The Price family went east on a Tuesday, and the house sat empty until it fell. But Caleb had survived. In the back pages of the journal, written in a hand that was faster and less careful than the earlier entries, as though the writer was afraid of running out of time before the important part got written down, was the account of how he had dug a pond, not in response to the drought, before it. 2 years before the drought arrived, in the spring of 1892, Caleb Briggs had dug a pond in the low corner of his land, the corner that flooded in wet years and cracked in dry ones, the corner everyone else in the county ignored as useless. He had lined it with the heavy clay subsoil he excavated. He had planted willows along the northern bank. He had built a simple channel that allowed water to move from the pond to the crop rows by gravity alone. And in the summer of 1894, when the creek stopped and the Garvey pond went to mud and families were walking away from their land, Caleb Briggs had water. At the bottom of the last page, underlined twice in the same faded ink, 4 words: dig before the sky forgets. Nora read those 4 words many times. Then she closed the journal and opened her own notebook and wrote them at the top of a blank page. Underneath, she began writing down every year of recorded drought she could remember hearing mentioned. 1894. She did not know the others yet. That required the library. The notebook was in her bag the following Saturday when the library doors opened. Addie Crane had been the head librarian in Harrow County for 22 years. She was 67 years old, wore her gray hair pinned up with a pencil she never seemed to use for writing, and had the quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent a lifetime in rooms full of knowledge and learned not to be in a hurry about any of it. When Nora came in and asked for drought records, historical ones for Harrow County and the surrounding region, and anything available on water retention in clay soils, Addie did not ask why. She said, "Give me 20 minutes," and disappeared into the stacks. She came back with a county agricultural extension report from 1931, a regional water table survey from 1989, a thin stack of Nebraska Historical Society bulletins going back to 1902, and something unexpected, a self-published pamphlet from 1978, authored by a farmer named Howard Briggs, who had apparently distributed copies at the county fair that year, arguing that Harrow County sat on a drought cycle repeating approximately every 28 to 33 years. The pamphlet had been noted in the local paper as eccentric and then forgotten. Addie set it on the table without comment. A column of years filled the notebook page. The extension reports and historical bulletins provided the data. 1894, 1926, 1958, 1988. The intervals stared back 32 years, 32 years, 30 years. The last entry was 1988, 31 years ago. No sense of prophecy settled over the table. Nora was not a dramatic girl. What she felt was the arithmetic weight of a pattern. The same feeling she got when a column of numbers finally resolved into an answer that was both inevitable and slightly frightening. She wrote 2019 at the bottom of the column and underlined it once. Then she found something else. Addie had included a folder of photocopied county water records, registration documents filed with the state of Nebraska going back to the territorial period. Most were routine, but near the bottom of the folder was a document dated September 14th, 1891, a water rights registration filed by Caleb Briggs of Harrow County, designated as Prior Appropriation Water Right Number 7, covering the underground aquifer system beneath the eastern section of Harrow County. With first use established and documented, the document had never been revoked. No notation of cancellation, no transfer of ownership, no legal challenge recorded anywhere in the file. It simply existed, the way old things sometimes exist when no one has thought to disturb them. She stared at it for a long time. Prior appropriation. She did not fully understand in legal terms, but she understood enough whoever held this right had a claim to that water predating almost everything else in the county's recorded history. Both sides of the document went into her phone's camera. The registration number went into the notebook. She looked up at Addie, who was reshelving something across the room. She asked if she could have a copy made. Addie made one and handed it across the desk. She said nothing about the second copy she made and filed in her own drawer, which Nora did not notice until much later. The low corner was staked out the following Monday morning, the same corner Caleb had chosen in 1892, the same ground that flooded in wet years and cracked in dry ones. Nora paced out a rectangle, 40 feet by 55, and pressed sticks into the four corners the way her great-great-grandfather had done with whatever he used to mark his own corners 127 years earlier. She started before her father was awake, with a long-handled spade and the stubbornness of someone who has decided on a thing and intends to do it regardless of what the air around them says. The first morning, Dale Fulton drove past on the county road in his white truck and slowed without stopping. 61 years old, 4 decades of farming his family's land. Authority worn the way he wore his belt buckle without thinking about it, because it had always been there. He rolled down the window and looked at the staked rectangle. "What are you putting in there?" he called out. "A pond," she said. She did not look up. A long silence. "That is your flattest ground," he said. "Yes, sir," she said. He drove away. By noon, he had told 4 people. Nora knew because by afternoon, a truck slowed on the county road every 30 minutes or so, paused, and then continued on. Nobody stopped to talk to her directly. They looked and left, which she understood was its own kind of conversation. The following Saturday, Dale's son-in-law Marcus came by, 34 years old, a business degree from Lincoln, managing the financial side of the Fulton operation with the confidence of someone who had never made a decision that cost him anything he could not absorb. He stood at the fence with his phone out and photographed the half-dug rectangle. The digging continued. Word of the photograph reached the house through the women at church, who mentioned it to Samuel at the feed store. Marcus had posted it in the county farming group with a caption about new agricultural techniques and a laughing face. Samuel came home and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his daughter. "You know what you are doing out there?" he asked. "I think so," she said. He went to the window and looked at the rectangle in the low corner, perhaps 18 inches deep at its center, the raw clay walls showing the color of old brick where she had cut through the topsoil. He went to the barn. He came back with the journal. He had not seen it since May put it away. For 45 minutes, he sat at the kitchen table and read without speaking. Nora sat across from him and watched him turn pages. His face did not change much. Samuel Briggs had the stoic quality of men who have learned that expression is a luxury they cannot afford in front of their children. When he finished, he closed the journal and set it on the table and looked out the window at the low corner for a long time. Then he said, "Line it with clay from the subsoil. Pack it in layers. Read the extension report from 1931 first. It explains the method. He picked up the journal and carried it back to the barn. That was the last time he asked what she was doing. The talk around Harrow County settled into a particular register, the quiet, concerned mockery of a community that believes it is being kind. People at the feed store asked Samuel about his daughter in voices carrying a softness around the edges, the softness people put on when they have already made up their mind about a situation. Women from church brought food to the house twice in March. Dale Fulton said at the diner one Tuesday morning, loud enough for several tables to hear, that Samuel must be too sick to stop the girl from ruining the only flat ground on the property. Only Addie. When Nora came back to the library for the extension report on clay pond lining, said anything that was not mockery wearing the face of concern. She looked across the library desk and said, "Your great-great-grandfather's name was in those water records. I have been thinking about that since you left." Nora looked at her. Addie said, "I sent a letter to the State Water Resources Office in Lincoln 2 weeks ago. I do not expect a quick response. But I thought someone in that office should know that registration exists." Nora did not know what to say to that. The librarian handed over the extension report and said, "Pack the clay in 6-inch layers. Let each one settle before you add the next. Your great-great-grandfather's notes in the back of that journal are consistent with the 1931 methodology." He figured it out without the report. The work continued. By late March, the pond was 30 inches deep at its center, and the first clay layer had gone in. The blisters from the first week had become calluses. She woke before her father now, every morning, dressed in the dark, went to the low corner and worked until the light changed, and it was time to start the rest of the day's work. The county's opinion did not shrink her. She was not the kind of person who is made smaller by being laughed at. If anything, being laughed at made her quieter. What the early mornings gave her was the creek. It ran along the eastern edge of the property, following the fence line, feeding eventually into a larger drainage that crossed the county road. Nora had watched that creek her whole life. She had played in it as a child. She had watched May crouch beside it in the evenings and press a palm into the current the way you test something you are not sure about. A measuring stick went into the bank at the same point every Sunday morning. January, before the journal 9 inches. Early March, when the digging started 6 inches. Last Sunday in March, 4.5. Early for that kind of drop. Not dramatically early, but early enough to circle the number in the notebook. She also noticed the survey stakes. Orange stakes on the public easement land running along the upper creek, where the water originated before it ran south through the county. They had not been there in February. The ground around them was disturbed, in the way ground is disturbed when something mechanical has been dragged across it. The date and description went into the notebook. She did not yet know what they meant. By the first week of April, the pond was holding 4 feet of water at its center from the spring rains. 6 willow saplings transplanted from the creek bank 2 miles east, carried in buckets of water in the back of the pickup on a Saturday afternoon, stood along the northern bank with their root balls packed firmly into the clay. The Fulton Pond, a natural water feature on the northern edge of Dale's property, had dropped 8 inches since March. Combined with the creek numbers and the survey stakes on the easement land, it made a pattern she could feel before she could fully articulate. She went back to the library. Addie was quiet for a moment when asked about survey activity on the Upper Creek easement. Then she went to her desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a folded document, a public notice, required by Nebraska law whenever a commercial operation applied for a land use modification on a county easement, published in the county weekly paper in the second week of March, buried in the legal listings section. The applicant was listed as Aquacore Environmental Solutions, LLC. The application was for preliminary geological assessment of groundwater resources on county easement parcels in the eastern drainage corridor of Harrow County. Approved by the county board the previous November. Nora read it twice. She looked at the approval date, November, before Christmas, before her father went to the hospital, before she found the journal. The document went into the notebook. She went home and kept digging, and measured the creek every Sunday, and watched the willows root along the north bank, and told no one what she was beginning to understand. She did not have enough of it assembled yet. She needed more of it in her hands before it could be shown to anyone. Samuel watched from the porch some mornings. He did not ask questions. He had the kind of trust that does not announce itself, that simply stands in the early light and watches and does not interfere, which was the most useful thing he knew how to give her. One evening in late April, he came in from the barn and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the notebook open on the table beside the journal. He looked at his daughter sitting where May had done the farm books for 16 years, with the same focused stillness May had brought to everything she believed mattered. He sat down across from her. He said, "Your mother kept a letter. It is in the tin box on your shelf. She told me where it was before she died. She told me not to open the box for you. She said you would know when to open it." Nora looked at him. He said, "I think she meant the letter, not the journal. The journal was your great-great-grandfather's. The letter was hers." The tin box came down from the shelf. The wax seal came off carefully. Inside, folded small, was a letter in May's handwriting. It unfolded standing by the window with the April light coming through the curtains. The letter was not long. May was not a woman who used more words than a thing required. The important part was near the bottom. It said, "I found the water registration in the county records when you were 4 years old. I had a lawyer in Kearney look at it. He said it was valid. He said nobody had ever challenged it because nobody knew it existed. He said if someone ever tried to take this land or the water under it, that document would matter more than anything else we own." I made a copy. The copy is in the tin box under this letter. The original is in the county records office, where Caleb put it in 1891. Do not let anyone tell you that old paper does not carry weight. Some paper carries more weight than anything built after it. The copy was beneath the letter, a clean photocopy, with May's handwriting in the margin, noting the date of review and the name of the lawyer in Kearney. Nora sat on the edge of her bed with the letter in one hand and the copy in the other for a long time. Outside, Samuel was coughing in the kitchen. Through the window, she could see the pond sitting full and still in the late April light. The willows standing thin and new along the north bank, with their roots reaching down toward what was underneath. Both documents went back into the tin box. The box went back on the shelf. She opened the notebook to the column of years: 1894, 1926, 1958, 1988, 2019. Beneath the column, in letters smaller and more careful than everything around them, she wrote, "May knew, Caleb knew, now I know." Then she closed the notebook and went to help her father with the evening work. And neither of them said anything about what was coming, because they were Briggs. And the Briggs way had always been to know a thing quietly and prepare for it without announcement, and let the land say the rest when the time came. May arrived the way it usually arrived in Harrow County, with enough warmth to make a person believe the worst was behind them. The corn went in on schedule. The soybeans went in 4 days after that. Samuel drove the old John Deere down the rows while Nora walked behind checking seed depth. And for a week, the farm looked the way a farm is supposed to look in May, purposeful and green-edged and pointed towards something. But the creek was at 3 inches on the first Sunday of May. She wrote it down and said nothing. The willows along the pond's north bank had taken. She could see it in the way they held themselves. No longer the tentative lean of newly transplanted things, but the settled posture of roots that have found what they were looking for. The pond sat at just under 5 feet at its center. A pair of mallards had appeared one morning in late April and claimed the eastern shallows with the absolute confidence of creatures that do not understand the concept of ownership and are therefore never troubled by it. Nora watched them from the bank sometimes in the early morning. She did not find this sentimental. She found it useful information. Birds follow water. The mallards staying meant the pond was doing what a pond is supposed to do. Then the trucks came. Three black SUVs moving down the county road on a Tuesday morning in the second week of May, followed by a flatbed carrying survey equipment. They turned onto the public easement road that ran along the Upper Creek corridor and parked. 12 men got out in matching vests with a corporate logo she could not read at that distance. One man stood apart from the others in a jacket and collared shirt, hands in his pockets, looking at the land the way a man looks at something he has already decided the value of. The library computer that weekend produced Warren Kessler, Aquacor's regional director, 52 years old, based out of Denver, with groundwater acquisition projects in 4 western states and a company bio that used phrases like sustainable resource management and community partnership in the way certain language gets used when the thing being described would not survive plain description. The company's primary business, as far as she could determine from what was publicly available, was acquiring long-term water rights in agricultural regions experiencing stress, then reselling controlled access to municipal and industrial buyers. His name went into the notebook. The date the trucks appeared on the easement road went in beside it, then the current creek depth. By the end of May, Dale Fulton had signed. She did not find out directly. She found out through the silence that falls over a conversation when a third person walks into a room. 2 men at the hardware store had stopped talking when Samuel came in to buy irrigation fittings. One of them nodded in a way that was not unfriendly but was not comfortable either. Samuel bought the fittings and came home and said nothing. Nora asked Addie the next Saturday. Dale had signed a 30-year groundwater lease with Aquacor at $800 per acre per year. Addie said, 200 acres. The math was not complicated. It had seemed, Addie said quietly, like an enormous amount of money for something he had never thought to put a price on. How many others? Nora asked. 6 families so far. The Carver brothers, the Ingram place, 4 more on the south side of the county road. Nora looked at the photocopy from the tin box, the one with May's handwriting in the margin. She had been carrying it in her notebook for 3 weeks. She asked Addie what prior appropriation meant in practical terms, in Nebraska law, in a situation where a company was drilling. Addie folded her hands on the desk. It means first in time, first in right, she said. In states that follow the doctrine, the oldest valid water claim takes priority over every claim filed after it. It does not matter how much money the newer claim represents or how large the company is. The older right is senior. It cannot be overridden by a later one. It can only be purchased or legally extinguished, and the holder has to agree to both. The photocopy went onto the desk between them. Addie looked at the registration number. She looked at the date. She looked at May's handwriting in the margin for a long time. Then she said, I am going to send another letter to Lincoln this week, and I am going to include this document. Nora said, I think they are going to come to our place eventually. Addie said, yes, I think so too. June arrived and the rains did not. There was a week in early June when the forecast showed rain every other day, and the clouds built in the afternoons and then moved east without releasing anything. Farmers watched them go and said it would come. June always came through. June did not come through. The creek dropped to 2 inches in the second week. The following Sunday, it was at 1 inch, a thin thread of water moving slow over the rocks, more sound than volume. In Caleb's column, the creek in 1894 had stopped entirely in July. They were arriving at July faster than the pattern predicted. She understood why on a Saturday afternoon, when she drove past the easement road and saw the drilling rigs, not survey equipment, actual rigs, 2 of them, running. Their sound reached her from the county road, a low mechanical grinding that traveled through the ground before it reached the air. The rigs sat at the 2 points on the upper aquifer that the 1989 water table survey had identified as the highest yield extraction locations in the eastern corridor. Whoever had done the site selection for Aquacor had read the same survey she had read at the library. The rigs ran around the clock. After dark, Two pale glows sat on the horizon above the tree line, visible from her bedroom window. The creek stopped on June 28th. It had been at less than half an inch for 3 days, and then one morning there was nothing there. Cracked mud and dry stone, and a smell rising from the exposed bed that was mineral and ancient and slightly wrong. The smell of something that had been wet for longer than anyone living could remember and had now gone dry. She stood at the bank for a long time. Then she went back to the house and wrote the date in the notebook with a circle around it. The way you circle a date when something you have been watching finally becomes what you knew it was going to become. The heat arrived in the first week of July and did not behave like ordinary heat. It settled over Harrow County with the permanence of something that has decided to stay. A flat, bright weight, pressing down from first light and not relenting at sundown. 104 degrees on 4 consecutive days in mid-July. And the combination of that heat with the absence of rain and the absence of the creek began to do what that combination always does to crops. Corn leaves curl when a plant is calculating its own survival. A physiological response, a reduction of surface area to slow water loss. The plant telling anyone paying attention that it is making decisions about what it can afford to lose. Nora watched the leaves curl in the afternoon heat and thought about Caleb writing in 1894 about the same sight in these same fields. He had not known it was a physiological response. He had just watched the plants and understood that they were doing what living things do under pressure, deciding what to hold and what to let go. The soybeans went yellow at the leaf edges, a yellowing that moved inward slowly, the way bad news travels through a community. Samuel watched the fields in the evenings from the porch. His cough had worsened in the heat, a dry, persistent sound through the bedroom wall at night that Nora had learned to hear the way you listen to a gauge that tells you the pressure inside a system you cannot otherwise see. She brought him water. She brought him the records she had been keeping. He looked at the creek measurements, the dates, the numbers, held the notebook a moment like a thing he recognized, and handed it back. She had not yet shown him the letter from May. Across the county road, things were moving differently. Dale Fulton's natural pond, the 3-acre water feature on the north end of his property, had been dropping since May. By mid-July, it sat at 30% of its usual summer level. Marcus had the AquaCore smart irrigation system running, the AI-controlled network of sensors and drip lines that had cost the Fulton operation $1.2 million and been installed in April with considerable satisfaction. Marcus had shown photographs of the dashboard interface to anyone who expressed interest and some who did not. The dashboard showed green status indicators and water flow rates and soil moisture readings in real time. It was sophisticated. The problem was that it measured flow through pipes connected to a pump drawing from a pond, dropping faster than any model predicted, because the same aquifer feeding the Fulton pond was being extracted from above by 2 drilling rigs running 24 hours a day on the easement land 2 miles north. Marcus ran the numbers for the first time in early July and got a result that did not make sense. He ran them again. He called the AquaCore technical support line and was told the system was operating within normal parameters and that any variation in water availability was attributable to seasonal drought conditions. He was told this by someone who had not been to Harrow County and did not intend to come. He ran the numbers a third time and stared at the result. By the last week of July, the Fulton Pond was at 15% capacity. The smart irrigation system showed amber on the dashboard. The corn on the Fulton eastern fields was showing stress Marcus had not seen since a bad year in 2012, and in 2012 there had been actual rain in June. One Sunday morning, Nora drove past the Fulton fields on her way to measure the creek bed. The corn leaves were curled tight in the early light before the heat had even fully arrived. She looked at those fields and then at the Briggs Pond, visible from the road, sitting full and still in the low corner with the willows casting a narrow band of shade on the water. She drove home and opened the gate between the pond and the first crop row, the irrigation channel built through late May and early June. while the county focused on whether AquaCorp's lease payments would change land values in time for fall assessments. Was a simple system. Shallow trenches running from the pond's overflow point across the field, controlled with wooden boards slotted into frames made from scrap lumber, following a design in the 1931 extension report that was itself following a design that had been in use for roughly 400 years in various forms. Nothing technical, nothing requiring electricity or sensors or a dashboard or a support line in another state. Water flowed downhill. She had built the channel downhill. That was the entire system. Standing at the channel's edge, she watched the water move through it in the early morning light, unhurried, going where it was built to go. Samuel came out of the house and stood beside her with a cup of coffee. He watched the water move for a while. He said your mother would have understood this. She did understand it. Nora said she left a letter. Samuel looked at her. She had been waiting for the right moment to hand a man a letter his wife had written before she died. Standing at the edge of a working irrigation channel on a morning when everything outside their fence line was beginning to fail seemed as right a moment as she was likely to find. She went inside and got the letter and brought it out. He read it standing at the channel's edge with the water moving past his boots. When he finished, he folded it along the original creases and held it against his chest. Not protectively exactly, more the way you hold something when you are not ready to put it down, but do not have a better place for it yet. She found the water record when you were 4, he said. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a long time. A kingfisher crossed the pond low and fast, there and gone before either of them could track where it landed. How long have you been carrying this, he said. Since April, she said. He nodded slowly. He looked at the corn rows the water was moving toward, the plants still green, still upright, still making their quiet calculations in a county where most of the other corn was already in trouble. He handed the letter back to her. He said, keep it safe. She put it back in her notebook. In August, the language in Harrow County changed. The word drought, which farming people avoid the way you avoid naming something you are afraid of giving more power to, began to be used openly. At the diner, at the feed store, at church, with the quietness people bring to a word when it is too late for it to be a warning and has become simply a description. 3 families on the south side of the county road stopped making payments on their equipment loans. The feed store ran short on certain supplies. The Carver brothers, who had signed with AquaCorp in May and been pleased about it, discovered that their shallow well, which had served 3 properties on the east side of the road for 40 years, had dropped 6 feet since June. They called AquaCorp. They were told that groundwater levels were affected by regional drought conditions and that this was outside the scope of their lease agreement. The Fulton Pond reached 10% capacity in the second week of August. Marcus stood at its edge and looked at the cracked mud that had been water in June and did not say anything to anyone because there was nothing to say. The dashboard now showed red, a color the system documentation described as indicating suboptimal resource availability, which he understood to mean the pond was almost gone and the system was telling him so in the most expensive way possible. Dale walked the east fields on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-August and did not come in for dinner. His wife called Marcus after an hour. Marcus found him standing at the fence line between the Fulton property and the county road, looking across at the Briggs place, at the pond, at the willows, at the crop rows with water still moving through them in a county where nothing else had water. Marcus stood beside him and said nothing. Dale said, without turning, I laughed at that girl in March. Marcus said nothing. Dale said, I stood on this road and laughed at a 14-year-old girl for digging a hole in her own field. He turned and walked back to the house. Marcus followed. Neither of them said anything else about it that evening. The following week, Warren Kessler came to the Briggs place for the first time. He drove alone, one black SUV, parked on the gravel shoulder outside the gate. He wore the kind of jacket that cost more than Samuel Briggs paid for diesel in a month, and he had the quality of a man who has delivered proposals to resistant parties many times and developed a patience about it that is not the same thing as kindness. Samuel was on the porch. Nora was in the field checking the channel boards. She came to the fence and watched. Kessler introduced himself and said he represented Aquacore Environmental Solutions and was in the county consulting with landowners about water resource planning. He said he understood the Briggs family was not part of the existing lease arrangement and that he wanted to offer an alternative that might be of interest given the current season. Samuel looked at him without expression. Aquacore was prepared to offer $94,000 for the purchase of the Briggs property. Kessler said this number had been specifically structured to address the existing debt on the land, which he appeared to know the amount of, and to provide the family with a clean exit from a difficult situation. Samuel said, "How do you know what we owe?" Kessler said that information was part of the public record in county land filings, in the tone of a man who finds questions about his methods slightly tiresome. "The land is not for sale." Samuel said. Kessler said he understood and that the offer would remain open. He gave Samuel a business card, which Samuel accepted without looking at it. Then Kessler looked past Samuel at Nora standing at the fence with her arms on the top rail, watching him. He looked at the pond. He looked at the channel. He looked at the crop rows with water still in them, and his expression changed in a way that was small enough that Samuel probably did not catch it. But Nora did, the expression of a man who has just recalculated something. He said goodbye and got in the SUV and drove away. Nora came up from the fence. Samuel was still holding the business card. She said he knows about the water under this land. Samuel looked at her. "He came not because we owe money," she said. "He came because this property sits on the aquifer that feeds the whole eastern corridor. He has been waiting for us to go under so he could buy at auction in November. But the pond is still full, and the crop is still alive, and now he knows he cannot wait." Samuel turned the business card over in his fingers. "He is going to come back with a bigger number or a threat," she said. "Probably the threat first." Samuel said, "What do we do?" She went inside and got the notebook and came back out and sat on the porch steps and opened it to the page with the water rights registration number and May's notes from the margin of the photocopy. She said, "We have prior appropriation water right number 7. Caleb registered it in 1891. It has never been revoked. It covers the underground aquifer system beneath the eastern section of this county. Aquacore's drilling permits were issued in 2018. Every permit they hold in this corridor is junior to our right by 127 years. That means legally, their permits cannot supersede ours. They have been extracting water from an aquifer we have senior claim to. Every gallon they have pumped since June may constitute an illegal taking." Samuel sat down on the porch beside her. "I need to get this document to someone at the state level who can do something with it." She said, Addie has already sent letters to Lincoln. I need more than letters now." Samuel was quiet for a long time. The evening light was flattening across the fields. From the porch, they could see the pond, still holding, the willows dark against the pale sky. The corn rows beyond it were dry at the edges, the way all corn was dry in August. But they were standing, making their calculations and arriving at a different result than the fields around them, because there was still water moving through the channels beneath them. "Your mother always said that land is not just what you can see," Samuel said. "She said it keeps things for you if you keep it right." He looked at the pond. He looked at the willows. She was right about most things. He said. Nora closed the notebook. She sat beside her father on the porch steps in the August heat, and they watched the light go down over the fields. And neither of them spoke again for a while, because there was nothing more that needed saying that evening. What the morning brought, 4 days later, was Kessler again, this time with a lawyer. The lawyer was younger than Kessler, wore a tie in August heat that suggested he was making a point about it, and carried a leather portfolio that he set on the porch railing with the deliberateness of someone trained to let objects do some of the intimidating before the words start. Nora wrote his name in her notebook immediately, which seemed to unsettle him slightly. He said Aquacorp had become aware of a potential water rights claim associated with the Briggs property, and the company wished to address this proactively. He used the word proactively twice. He said the document in question, referring to Caleb's 1891 registration, was of uncertain legal standing given its age and the changes in Nebraska water law over the intervening century, and that pursuing such a claim through the state system would be a lengthy and expensive process for a family in their financial position. He opened the portfolio. He slid a document across the porch railing toward Samuel. Aquacorp was revising its offer to $118,000. He said, structured as a full purchase of the property and a full release of any water rights claims, historical or current. Samuel looked at the document. He did not touch it. He looked at Nora. You said the document is of uncertain legal standing, she said to the lawyer. The lawyer said that was correct. Then why did the offer go up $24,000 in 4 days? She said. The lawyer began to say something about goodwill gestures and the company's commitment to fair dealing with community landowners. Nora stopped listening to the specific words and focused instead on the fact of them, on the way a man sounds when he is covering a position rather than explaining it, the quality of language that uses more words than the truth requires. We are not selling, she said. The lawyer looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at the document on the porch railing and then at the lawyer and said, you can take that with you. The lawyer took it. He said the family should understand that pursuing an unresolved historical water claim without legal representation would be a complex undertaking, and that the company would have no choice but to engage its own legal team in response to any such filing, which could result in the county court issuing a temporary freeze on the property's financial instruments pending resolution. He meant the bank. He meant the loan. He meant November. Samuel said nothing. Kessler, who had been silent through all of it, spoke then for the first time. He said, Mr. Briggs, I want to be straight with you. This drought is not going to break before your note comes due. You know that, and I know that. The yield you bring in this fall will not cover $52,000. Your options are limited, and the clock is moving. We are offering you a way out. I would take it seriously. He said it without cruelty. He said it the way a man says something he believes to be true and has the resources to wait for you to agree with. He was not wrong about the numbers. He was not wrong about the clock. He was wrong about one thing, and it was the thing that mattered. And he did not know yet. Samuel stood up from the porch steps. I know what the clock says. He said, I have been farming this land since before you were in this business. You can go now. Kessler looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up the portfolio from the railing, nodded once, and walked back to the SUV. Nora watched the vehicle until it disappeared around the bend in the county road. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened the notebook to a clean page and wrote the date at the top. She wrote the lawyer's name. She wrote the amount of the revised offer. She wrote the phrase, temporary freeze on financial instruments. She wrote the phrase, uncertain legal standing. She drew a line under that phrase, and beneath it wrote a single word wrong. Then she picked up the notebook and her mother's letter and the photocopy of the water registration and went to find Addie Crane. Addie was not surprised to see her. She was standing behind the library desk when Nora came through the door, and she looked at the notebook and the documents and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, sit down. I have something to tell you first. She came around the desk and sat across from Nora at the reading table nearest the window. She folded her hands on the table. She said, I received a response from Lincoln 3 days ago, not from the Water Resources Office, from the Office of the State Engineer, a woman named Patricia Hale. She is a groundwater hydrologist, and she has been investigating Aquacorp for 7 months based on complaints from 2 other counties where the company has operating permits. She said my March letter was the first documentation she had received connecting Aquacorp's eastern Nebraska operations to a senior prior appropriation claim. She asked me to send any supporting materials I had. Nora set the photocopy on the table. Addie looked at May's handwriting in the margin. She said, "Is this the original copy your mother made?" "Yes," Nora said. Addie picked it up carefully. She said, "Patricia Hale needs this. Not a copy of a copy. This one, with your mother's notation and the lawyer's review date. This is the document that establishes the chain of custody going back to the original filing." "Then she should have it," Nora said. She said it without hesitation, which was the only way she knew how to say things she had already decided. She had decided before leaving the house. She had decided when she wrote the word wrong in the notebook and understood that wrong was not the same as harmless, and that a thing being wrong did not fix itself without someone carrying the right paper to the right place. Addie made a clean copy of everything Nora had brought. Then she called Patricia Hale's office from the library phone because she was 67 years old and did not trust documents to arrive safely without a phone call preceding them. She reached Hale directly, which surprised her. She explained what she had. She read the water rights registration number from the copy. There was a silence on the line that was not the silence of someone uninterested. Patricia Hale said she would drive to Harrow County the following week. She said it the way people say things when they have been waiting for a specific piece of information and it has just arrived. Nora walked home. 4 miles on a gravel road in August heat, and she did not mind it. She needed to think through what came next, not in the broad terms she had been thinking in all summer, but in the specific terms of the next 7 days, the next 4 weeks, the distance between now and November, and what had to happen in that distance. The note on the Briggs land was due November 14th. 78 days. The crop would be harvested in October. What survived of it, which would not be enough. She had known since July that it would not be enough. The pond had kept the corn alive, but alive was not the same as abundant. And a reduced yield in a drought year, sold into a market where everyone else in the region was also selling reduced yields, would not reach $52,000. She had known this for a while. She had not told her father because she did not want him to agree to sell before she had something in her hands worth holding. She thought about Kessler's face when he looked at the pond that first day, the small recalculation in his expression. He had been waiting for November to bring the land to auction. The pond and the living crop had disrupted that plan, which was why he had come with the first offer, and then the second, and then the lawyer with phrases about uncertain legal standing and financial instrument freezes. He was trying to do in August what he had planned to let the bank do in November. He was trying to buy what he wanted before someone else understood its value. She walked home and went straight to the barn and checked the clay lining at the pond's northern edge and found it holding, and went inside and helped her father with dinner and said nothing about Addie's call. She would tell him when there was more to tell. The Briggs way had always been to bring the whole thing rather than pieces of it. Patricia Hale arrived on a Wednesday. She drove a state vehicle, gray, with a magnetized agency seal on the door she had clearly not thought about removing before pulling into a small county where the sight of a government car generated a specific kind of attention. 39 years old, field clothes rather than office clothes, a battered canvas bag suggesting someone who spent more time at dig sites and pump stations than at desks. She had the direct, unhurried quality of a person who has been doing technically difficult work long enough to stop being anxious about it. She met Nora and Samuel at the kitchen table. Addie came with her, which Samuel had not expected. He looked at Addie and then at his daughter and understood this had been in motion for longer than the last 2 days, and he accepted this without comment, which was itself a form of trust that Nora recognized and was grateful for. Patricia laid out what she had in plain language. AquaCorp had applied for and received 4 groundwater extraction permits in Harrow County beginning in 2018, covering the upper aquifer corridor in the eastern drainage region. The company had represented to the state permitting office that there were no senior prior appropriation claims on the relevant aquifer system. This representation had been accepted because no senior claims appeared in the electronic records database the permitting office used for searches. She paused. The electronic database was compiled from paper records in 1997, she said. The compilation was incomplete. Documents predating 1920 were not consistently digitized. Prior appropriation water right. Number 7, registered by Caleb Briggs in 1891, was in the original paper archive but was not included in the 1997 digital compilation. It did not appear in the search Aquacor's legal team ran before applying for permits. Samuel said so they did not know. Patricia set her hands flat on the table. Their legal team ran a search that should have been more thorough. She said, whether they did not know or chose not to look harder is a question my office is currently examining in the context of their operations in 2 other counties where similar patterns have occurred. What I can tell you with certainty is that the right exists. It is valid. It is senior to every permit Aquacor holds in this corridor, and under Nebraska prior appropriation law, senior rights are not diminished by the passage of time or by administrative oversight. She looked at Nora. The document your mother preserved and the notation she left establishing the legal review are significant, she said. They demonstrate that the family was aware of the right and took steps to verify its validity. That matters in an administrative proceeding. Samuel said, what does this mean for the drilling? Patricia looked at him steadily. I have the authority to issue a temporary cessation order on extraction operations in conflict with a senior prior appropriation claim pending review. She said, so I issued it this morning before I drove here. Aquacor's rigs in the upper corridor are required to stop operations within 48 hours. The kitchen was very quiet. 48 hours, Samuel said. Yes, they can contest the order through the state water court. That process takes time, and the burden of proof in a prior appropriation dispute falls on the junior claimant. Aquacor would need to demonstrate the senior right is invalid, which, based on what I have reviewed, they cannot do. Nora said, what about the families who signed leases? The Fultons, the Carvers. Patricia said the lease agreements are contracts between private parties and are not directly affected by the extraction order. However, if it is determined that Aquacor misrepresented the regulatory status of their operations to landowners when soliciting those agreements, there may be grounds for the affected parties to seek relief. That is a separate matter and not within my office's authority, but it is the kind of question a county attorney might be interested in. She looked at her canvas bag. There is one more thing, she said. The prior appropriation right held by your family covers the underground aquifer system beneath the eastern section of Harrow County. That is a significant water resource. The state has an interest in how that resource is managed going forward, particularly in the context of climate-related agricultural stress in the region. My office would like to discuss a formal management agreement with your family, which would include compensation for the state's use of that resource data in regional water planning. She named a number. Samuel looked at Nora. For a moment, the girl looked at the table. She thought about Caleb in 1892 driving stakes into the corners of his low ground while the county watched and said nothing useful. She thought about May in the county records office reading a document that was older than everyone in the building, understanding what it meant, making a copy, writing a letter, sealing it in a tin box. She thought about Addie sending a letter to Lincoln in March and not receiving an answer and sending another one and not stopping. She looked up at Patricia Hale and said, we would like to hear the terms. What followed was not simple or fast, because almost nothing involving the state and a corporate legal team and a prior appropriation dispute from 1891 is simple or fast. But some things moved more quickly than expected. Aquacor's legal team filed a contest to the cessation order within 48 hours, which was expected. The state water court scheduled a preliminary hearing for late September, earlier than Patricia had anticipated, which she attributed to the specificity and completeness of the documentation Nora had provided, a claim supported by an unbroken chain of documentation going back to the original 1891 filing, with a verified legal review from a licensed Nebraska attorney in the early 2000s, was not the kind of claim that presented ambiguity. It presented a record. Records moved faster than arguments. Aquacor's rigs, went quiet on a Thursday evening. Nora heard the silence from her bedroom window before she fully understood what it was, because the low mechanical sound from the horizon had been there so long that its absence was its own kind of sound. She lay still and listened to the quiet for a while and then got up and went to the window. The pale glows above the tree line were gone. She stood there for a long time. Then she went back to bed and slept better than she had in months. The aquifer did not recover overnight. Water does not move that way. But within 3 weeks of the rig stopping, a thread of water appeared in the creek bed, less than half an inch, barely moving. But there, she wrote the date and measurement and the word returning in the notebook and drew a small circle around it. The Fulton Pond did not recover in time to save the summer crop. 200 acres of Fulton corn came in at roughly 30% of normal yield, which was what Marcus had calculated and what Dale had refused to say out loud until the harvest was done and the number was in front of him. Dale sat with the yield report for a long time at his kitchen table. He did not throw it. He did not raise his voice. He had the stillness of a man absorbing something too large to react to usefully. Marcus said, "We need to talk about next year." Dale said, "Yes, we do." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to talk to the Briggs girl first." Marcus looked at him. "About the pond," Dale said. "About the clay lining. About how it worked." He said it the way a man says something he has been working up to for a while and has finally decided is more important than the discomfort of saying it. The Carver brothers contacted the county attorney in the second week of September, after Patricia Hale's office released a preliminary finding stating that AquaCorp had failed to conduct adequate due diligence regarding senior water rights in the Eastern Corridor prior to soliciting lease agreements from county landowners. The finding did not use the word fraud. It used the phrase material misrepresentation of regulatory status, which the county attorney said amounted to the same thing in practical terms and was considerably more useful in a civil proceeding. By October, 4 of the 6 families who had signed AquaCorp leases had engaged the county attorney to explore their options. The Fulton family was not among the 4. Dale had reviewed his lease agreement 3 times and understood that his situation was more complicated, because he had signed with full knowledge that the company was conducting extraction operations and had asked no questions about the regulatory basis for those operations. This was not a defense, but it was a distinction. And Dale Fulton was a man who understood distinctions. He came to the Briggs place on a Saturday morning in the first week of October. He drove his white truck down the lane and parked by the barn and stood outside, which was the county signal that you want to talk, but will wait to be invited. Nora was checking the channel boards at the far end of the field. She saw him from a distance and walked back. She had thought about this moment in the abstract way you think about things you know are coming. She had not thought about it as a triumph. She had not constructed the conversation in her head the way people do when they are anticipating being right in front of someone who was wrong. She was too tired for that, and too practical, and too much her mother's daughter. She walked up to the fence and looked at him. Dale Fulton was 61 years old and had farmed his family's land for 4 decades and had stood on the county road in March and laughed at a 14-year-old girl for digging a hole in her own field. He was now a man who had lost the better part of a year's income and had his name attached to a lease agreement with a company under state investigation and had watched his natural pond go to cracked mud while a pond dug by that same girl held water through the worst summer in 30 years. He looked smaller than he had in March, not in the dramatic way of stories, in the plain way of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has stopped pretending it is not heavy. He said, "I owe you an apology." "You do not owe me anything." "Mr. Fulton," she said. He looked at her. "I did not dig the pond to prove something to you," she said. "I dug it because the journal said to dig it and the number said this summer was coming. You laughed because it looked like the wrong decision. It looked like the wrong decision to most people. That is not something I hold against anyone." Dale turned his cap in his hands. He said, "You are more generous than the situation requires." "I am practical," she said. "Holding things against people takes time I do not have." He almost smiled at that. Not quite. He said, I want to learn how it works. The pond, the clay lining, the channel system. My natural pond is recovering slowly, but I want a built one on the North 40 where I can control it. I want to do it before next spring. I can show you the method, she said. The 1931 extension report has everything you need. I can walk the North 40 with you and look at where the clay runs. I would appreciate that, he said. Come back Thursday morning, she said. Bring boots. He nodded. He put his cap back on. He looked at the pond sitting full in the October light with the willows yellow-leafed along the north bank, then looked at the crop rows beyond it. The corn harvested now, but the ground still dark and damp from the irrigation water that had moved through the channel all summer. He said your father raised you right. My mother did most of it, she said. He nodded once more and got back in his truck and drove away. The state management agreement took until late October to finalize. Patricia made 2 more trips to Harrow County and spent considerable time going through the terms with both Samuel and Nora, explaining in plain language because she was the kind of official who believed plain language was a form of respect. The agreement designated the Briggs property as a cooperative water monitoring site for the state's eastern Nebraska groundwater program. The family retained full ownership of the land and full control of the water rights. The state received access for monitoring equipment and the right to use the data in regional planning. In exchange, the state paid the Briggs family a one-time documentation and cooperation fee. The number was $310,000, structured in 2 payments, the first upon signing, the second 60 days after the state water court issued its preliminary ruling on the AquaCorp contest, which Patricia said was a formality given the record. The first payment arrived in the 3rd week of October. It was enough to retire the full loan balance, cover the shortfall from the reduced harvest, and leave a remainder that Samuel put in an account without discussing what it was for, because he was not a man who made announcements about money. He did say one thing the evening the payment cleared. They were sitting on the porch in the October cool, the kind of evening that comes after a brutal summer with the quality of something that has been through a great deal and arrived, finally, at rest. He looked at the pond. He looked at the willows, bare now at the tips but still holding their leaves further down, yellow in the late light. He said your great-great-grandfather dug that pond in 1892 and it held water in 1894, and nobody wrote about it in any newspaper and nobody gave him any money for it, and he just went back to farming. He put what he knew in a journal and put the journal in a crate and left it in the barn. Nora said he wrote at the bottom dig before the sky forgets. Samuel said yes. He did. He was quiet for a while. He said I should have found that journal years ago. You found it when it was needed, she said. We both did. He looked at her. May knew where it was. She said, she left it there on purpose. She trusted that whoever needed it would find it when the time came. Samuel looked out at the fields. He said she was always better at trusting the timing of things than I was. He picked up his coffee cup and looked into it and set it back down. He said she would have liked to see the water come back to the creek. I think she would have just nodded and said she expected as much. Nora said, he made a sound that was not quite a laugh but lived in the neighborhood of one, and it was the first time she had heard anything like it from him in longer than she could specifically remember. She did not call attention to it. She let it sit there on the porch with them in the October air and be what it was. The AquaCorp contest was heard in the state water court in early November. The hearing lasted 4 hours. AquaCorp's legal team presented an argument centered on the incomplete digitization of pre-1920 records and the doctrine of administrative reliance, which held that a party should be able to depend on the results of an official state database search when making regulatory filings. The argument was technically constructed and delivered by people paid to deliver such arguments with conviction. The court's preliminary ruling held that administrative reliance could not override a valid senior prior appropriation right, that the responsibility for due diligence in a water rights acquisition extended beyond database searches to the original paper record, and that the state permitting office's failure to include the 1891 registration in its digital compilation did not constitute the extinguishment of that right. The cessation order was upheld. Aquacor's extraction permits in the eastern Harrow County corridor were voided pending a full administrative review. Kessler was not in the courtroom when the ruling was read. His company's local representative was a young man in a good suit who sat very still when the ruling came and then made a phone call immediately afterward in the courthouse parking lot that went on for a long time. The formal investigation into Aquacor's practices across 3 Nebraska counties, the one Patricia Hale's office had been building for 7 months, expanded in scope following the court's ruling. It would not be resolved quickly. These things rarely were. But it was moving, and moving in a direction that Kessler's legal team would spend considerable money trying to slow down, which is different from stopping. 3 of the 4 families who had engaged the county attorney reached preliminary agreements with Aquacor in December, agreements that included the return of lease payments and a release of further claims in exchange for the family's agreement not to join the state investigation as formal complainants. The county attorney noted publicly, at a county board meeting, in plain language, that the agreements were structured in a way suggesting the company wished to limit the expansion of the investigation. This resulted in a brief article in the regional newspaper that was read by several people who had not been paying attention before. Patricia came back to Harrow County in November to install the first monitoring equipment on the Briggs property, 2 small sensor arrays placed at the pond's edge and at the creek bank, connected by a wire run to a data logger in the barn. The installation took most of a Saturday. Nora helped carry equipment and asked questions about what the sensors measured and how the data was transmitted to the state system. And Patricia answered all of them in the direct, complete way she answered things, without condescension and without simplifying. At the end of the day, standing at the pond's edge with the sensors in place and the late November light going flat across the water, Patricia looked at the pond, and then at the willows, and then at the irrigation channel running toward the crop ground. She said, "The woman who wrote the letter in that tin box, your mother?" "Yes," Nora said. "She had the document reviewed by a licensed attorney." Patricia said, "She preserved the chain of custody and wrote instructions for a 9-year-old and sealed it in a box and waited. She died not knowing if any of it would matter. She knew it would matter." Nora said she just did not know when. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have been doing this work for 11 years. In every case I have found where a senior water right went unrecognized. The resource was eventually acquired by someone with the money and the patience to wait for the family to need to sell. That is the usual outcome." She looked at Nora. "This is not the usual outcome," she said. Nora said nothing to that. She looked at the pond. The water was lower in November, lower than it had been in July, because autumn had taken some of it and she had not yet closed the inlet for the winter. But it was holding. The clay was doing what clay does when properly packed and given time, becoming part of the land rather than a layer on top of it. She thought about Caleb not writing the journal for anyone in particular. He had written it because he was the kind of man who could not watch something important happen without making a record of it. That was enough. It had always been enough. She thought about May in the county records office, reading a territorial document from 1891, understanding what it was, having a lawyer read it, making a copy, writing a letter, sealing everything in a tin box, pressing it into the hands of a 9-year-old daughter with 3 words that would not make sense for 5 more years. May had done all of that knowing she was running out of time, knowing she might not be there when the earth cracked, trusting that Nora would be. Patricia packed her tools into the canvas bag and said goodbye and drove her gray state vehicle back down the lane and turned onto the county road and disappeared toward the highway. Nora stood at the pond's edge a while longer. The November air was cold and still. The willows had dropped most of their leaves, their bare branches fine and dark against the pale sky. The water reflected the clouds moving overhead, slow and high and carrying nothing. Not yet. She opened the notebook. She turned to the next blank page. At the top, she wrote, November, year 1 of the monitoring record. She wrote the date. She wrote the pond depth. She wrote the creek measurement. The thin thread of water that had returned to the bed since the rigs went quiet. Still not what it had been in January, but moving, recovering, doing what water does when you stop taking more than the land can give back. She wrote, the willows are established. The clay is holding. The channel is clear. She wrote, Caleb built something that lasted 127 years without anyone knowing it was there. May found it and kept it and passed it forward. The work now is to keep it going. She closed the notebook. Behind her, across the county road, she could see the Fulton property, the bare fields, and the recovering pond, and the new stake markers Dale had driven into the North 40 the previous Thursday morning. Marking out the corners of the pond he intended to dig before the ground froze, with clay lining and willows and a gravity channel running toward the crop rows. Built on a method from 1931 that was itself built on observations older than that. Because some knowledge does not become less true with time, it only becomes more necessary. She walked back to the house. Her father was on the porch with his coffee, watching the last of the light go across the fields. He looked at the notebook in her hands and at her face, and then back at the fields. He said, Patricia get everything she needed. Yes, Nora said. He nodded. She sat on the step below him, and they watched the light go down together, the way they had been doing all summer, without needing to explain to each other what they were watching for, because they both already knew. The land was still there. The water was coming back. The notebook was full, and the tin box was on the shelf, and the letter was inside it. May's handwriting in the margin of a copy of a document from 1891, a chain of careful hands passing something forward through time until it reached the hand that needed it. A red-winged blackbird crossed the far edge of the pond and settled into the willows, there for a moment, and then gone. The way things go when they have done what they came to do. Nora watched the place where it had been. She did not need to write that down. Some things you just carry.
When I was young, I chased the horizon. Certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy. The storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me. They were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey. Every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way. The mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken. I've known fear that stole my breath. I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher. Every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve obstacle and destination will never separate all this time. The road